Welcome to Curiosity First. I'm Thomas Chan Stevenson. Today I will be speaking with Jim Rutt. He is an entrepreneur, technologist, and systems thinker, best known for his role as the former chairman of the Sante Fe Institute and the former CEO of Network Solutions. He is a prominent Game B thinker and one of the co-originators of the Game B movement, which seeks to create an alternative to existing socio-economic systems. In addition, he hosts the Jim Rutt Show, a podcast where he explores complex systems, evolutionary biology, and philosophy. Today we speak about what Game B is, the Dunbar number, and how to build a better society, among other topics. If you'd like to support this podcast, please join my Patreon. I have no paid subscribers at this point, and I could really use the help in order to support this program.
Hey.
All right, we're recording. So, Jim, how you doing? You doing good?
Yeah, doing good. Can't complain. If I do, don't get any sympathy, so why bother?
Yeah. So do you want to start with like your background? And like I'm very interested because you grew up in Appalachia, right? And then you ended up at MIT, and then you were working in like network solutions, and then you ended up getting involved with Sante Fe Institute. Can you give me that whole journey? I'm just fascinated with that.
Well, I didn't grow up in Appalachia. I live in Appalachia now. In fact, today
I thought you grew up. Sorry, I'm mistaken. Okay.
Yeah, I live in Appalachia now. Here's a little view out the window of our beautiful mountains and such, and very deep in Appalachia. In fact, grew up in a working class suburb of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Called Prince George's County. Why's that damn thing not quite right? Here, let's get that thing better. I took it off. I changed the angle. How's that look? That's probably a little too much. There we go. That looks better. All right. Yeah. So anyway, I grew up in a working class suburb of DC. My dad was a DC cop, and he dropped out of high school after 9th grade. My mother left home at the age of 14, left the wilds of northern Minnesota, and ended up in Washington D.C., where she lied about her age and got a job as a telephone operator. And yeah, I did pretty good in high school, and went to MIT, where I was a disillusioned youth, I would say. Spent more time drinking and doing drugs and chasing women than I did studying, which was fine. I had a good time. This would have been in the 70s, and there was few times that were better for partying than the early 70s. Graduated, hitchhiked around the country, fucked off for 2 years. Had a good time then too. Then I went to work in the college textbook publishing industry for 2 or 3.5 years. Sorry, a little bit of noise. There, guys are mowing the lawn out
No
inside.
problem at all.
So, it's a little bit. The guy just went right by the window. It might be the only time he goes that close. So yeah, I did college textbook publishing for about 3.5 years, and when I was going around visiting college professors all the time. And I started seeing these things under desks, big old boxes. Like, what the hell is that? And they'd say it's a personal computer. And when I was in college, of course, I'd done a little bit of computer stuff, but I was not taken with the big mainframe, the glass room, the bureaucracy, all that crap. So I had very little interest in computers other than learning how to program them a little bit. But when I saw these on these people's desks in, say, 78, 79, I go, whoa, personal computer, that's an interesting idea. So in 1980, I spent about 90% of my net worth and bought a loaded Apple II with a fancy dot matrix printer and two floppy disk drives. I was about the only guy in Lexington, Kentucky that had 2 floppy disk drives. People would come over to my house to copy software and stuff. And I got back into programming in a major way. I wrote the world's champion Othello program, amazingly beat an IBM mainframe running on an Apple II. And sort of decided that whatever I did next would have to be technology oriented. And so I went and looked at, looking for other jobs, and got several offers in educational software. Since I was coming out of textbook business, it made sense. Vice president of marketing, even though I had no managerial experience, that's all right. But instead, I ended up going to work for a company called The Source, which was the world's first consumer online service. In 1980, actually in 79, I joined in 80. In 79, they were doing much of what we see on the web today: chats and email and online shopping, news services. They even did the world's first online Catholic confession. They got it approved by the Archbishop of Washington, and a priest and one of the users did a confession over chat. Pretty funny. Anyway, I was the regional sales manager initially, but then came in-house and started working on product, built a number of, designed and managed several products. Unfortunately, The Source was owned by the Reader's Digest, which younger people may not remember, but it was a multi-billion-dollar publishing company at its peak. Eventually went bankrupt, but at that time it was a big deal. A couple of billion a year in revenue. For some god-awful reason, they bought this little company from the incompetent entrepreneur who had started it. And anyway, me and they did not get along too well after a while. So I quit and went and started my own company to take some of the technologies and ideas that we had used for building product at The Source, which was aimed at consumers. You have to tell this part of the story. They're aimed at consumers, and a lot of the stuff we have on the web today, but in character mode. It was green screen character mode, 30 characters per second. If you paid the upgrade, it was 120 characters a second, really slow. And it cost $10 an hour. And that's in $1980, so about the equivalent of $35 or $40 an hour today. So you say, why would anybody do that? Well, it was the only way in the world that a civilian person not associated with the military or university had access to any networks. And so we quickly had tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of customers, even at that very high price. So I then joined up with another guy, and he and I took the ideas on how to do this stuff relatively inexpensively and in a user-friendly fashion. And he had some connections on Wall Street. So we went to Wall Street and started building online information products for them. And we built several of them. And then we sold the whole bundle of companies to a big multinational publisher, Thomson Corporation, now Thomson Reuters, who wanted to get into the online information for Wall Street world. Then I left soon thereafter. Once again, me and big companies didn't get along too well. Went and started another company, did the world's first user customizable newsletter that actually laid out a newsletter using early AI and sent it to them via fax, each one custom to the interests of the subscriber. It was kind of business. We ended up selling it, got most of the investors' money back, but that's about all you could say. I helped start one of the cell phone companies, that one of the pieces that became T-Mobile. Let's see what else did I do in the business world. I did another couple little things, too small to worry about. Then 1992, I got a call from Thomson wanting me to come back and give them 2 days consulting on some technology problems they've had. Went back and did the analysis, and they then offered me a job, which for some reason I said yes to, and I ended up staying at Thomson for 6.5 years. Ended up as the first CTO of the $8 billion a year company. I had 5,000 techies reporting to me. It was kind of interesting. Then my last gig was Network Solutions. I really intended to work at Thomson until I retired. A great bunch of people, great family that was a 60% shareholder. But I got an offer I couldn't refuse from Network Solutions, who at the time were the evil monopolists that ran the domain name system and did not do it very well. And they were already publicly traded, so I was brought in as kind of the turnaround guy. And so turn it around I did. And a year later, I sold the company for a god-awful amount and said, all right, enough's enough. I retired and reinvented myself as a scientist. And it was from there that I got involved in the Sante Fe Institute. Somebody wrote a New York Times story about this. Internet CEOs doing what? And they came down and interviewed me and all this stuff. And, somebody at the Sante Fe Institute read that because I was doing things that are related to the kind of things they do. And they called me up and said, hey, you want to come out here? And I go, sure. So I went out and met with them. And next thing you know, they'd offered me a position out there. And for various family reasons, it made sense for us to relocate. So my wife, my daughter, and myself moved to Santa Fe, where we lived for 10 years. And I did the Sante Fe Institute thing, which was great.
So how did your, I guess, interest in complexity science, like, influence your view on like social issues and lead you into like coming up with Game B kind of ideas and stuff like that? Like, how does Santa Fe fit into all that? And like, can you give me the journey of Game B and the different schools of thought in it, and what it's all about?
That's a lot to talk about. Yeah, I'll see what
Yeah,
I'll go a ways, and you can ask some follow up questions. I actually started seeing.
of course. Yeah.
When we talk about game A and game B, we mean game A is the current game that society is mostly in. So no matter who you are, if you're an Uber Eats driver or if you're a CEO of Bank of America, you're all still playing game A basically. Game B is an alternative social operating system, and we believe that Game A is nearing the end of its useful life, and it will either transition to something else or it'll crash hard sometime in the next decade or two. And interestingly, even though here I was as a pretty senior executive and a multi-billion-dollar multinational, in 1994 I started seeing the problems with Game A. The obvious one: exponential growth in a finite world. How's that going to work for very long?
Mm-hmm.
I also started getting morally offended by the whole idea of advertising and what I would now call attention hijacking. I also, because you can imagine some of the people I was working with who were senior executives at big companies, they had all these weird status games that they played, fancy cars, big houses, third wives with silicone tits, all that shit. I continued to drive my 15-year-old pickup truck, lived in the same house I've been living in for 17 years, and still married to the same wonderful girl I've been married to for 43 years now. And so I started seeing sort of appalling status games, uh, exponential growth in a finite world, and attention hijacking. And I wrote a couple little internal essays and shared them on The Well, which was an online service I used to be, still am a member of. And it kind of got me interested in thinking about alternatives. But I was a real busy guy, right? And I was a father of at that point, a 5-year-old. And, so I only spent a little time thinking about it. But then I started learning about complexity in the late 90s. And I started applying it to business at Thomson, found some very interesting applications. And then once I was actually at the Sante Fe Institute, I started thinking about, all right, what does complexity mean about this old idea of, hey, our current game is screwed? And I just kind of mused on it, but didn't really do anything about it. And then I kind of started doing a dive into alternative monetary systems and learned all about monetary theory and how the monetary systems work, and came up with a proposal for a new monetary operating system. And then in 2008, I met a guy named Jordan Greenhall at the time, now known as Jordan Hall. He was a young trustee at the Sante Fe Institute. I was, I think, vice chairman at the time. And after the first meeting he attended, he and I did this often with the new trustees, just sat down, wanted to chat with him for 15 or 20 minutes, see what he was about as a person, et cetera. Well, and we ended up talking for 4 hours. And I would say that the idea of Game B was synthesized during that conversation. We didn't call it that. We didn't know what it was. But in 4 hours, what he added and what I added were like this, came together. And whoa, this is quite interesting. But we both agreed we hadn't figured out enough. So we went back and stayed in touch, of course. We met at board meetings, we'd email, we'd Skype, which was the thing before Zoom and all that. And then in 2012, I put my thoughts together into a 64-page paper and I sent it to him. And he goes, whoa, okay. So then
Was this after you had what was it called? The Emancipation Party thing? Or
actually, the paper led to the Emancipation Party.
Okay.
And Jordan put it out to some people. I put it out to some people. And we quickly pulled together some people, and we built the Emancipation Party. We weren't the right people to do a political party. Time wasn't right. After about 6 months, being good business guys, Jordan and I, and we actually had 3 other former corporate CEOs as part of the effort. We analyzed the market, said to market, this is not a sellable product at this time. And so we then transitioned it to Game B, which we thought of as, a slower, grassroots-oriented social operating system change that didn't need to engage in electoral politics, at least no time soon. And we put together, I don't know, we had like 100 people working on Game B in 2013. And then at the end of 2013, Game B blew up famously. And we went to war with each other, and I declared it over. And I said, we're going into spore mode now. And that's literally what I called it. I said, take what you've learned, be like a mushroom spore, go out into the world, and maybe someday the spore will sprout. And then for various reasons, the spore sprouted in 2017, and Game B started reforming and has gone a long way since then. Many, many, many people affiliated with it these days, and lots more good thinking, etc. And that's basically, and then, there's, and the other key thing about it, which was always the thought that this is not the work of any one or two people. This is not Jim Rutt and Jordan Hall, right? This is about 30 different thinkers who have had a significant contribution to the Game B thought, and hundreds of other people have contributed some and have participated in virtual events and things of that sort. So anyway, back, what is it? If we say Game A is the life we're living, Game B is the life we should be living, right? And in very shorthand, I'd say it is a way of living that is oriented towards human well-being, rightly understood, within a context that fully honors our planetary limits and the health and diversity of the biosphere. And, easy to say, hard to do, but it has lots of interesting implications. For instance, the lifestyle of current Americans, Australians, and Canadians is about 3 times as intense as it could be to be sustainable long-term for everybody on Earth. So over a period of, call it 50 or 60 years, those hyper burner societies need to cut their consumption by about 2/3, Europe by about half, and the rest of the world can come up a lot. People in sub-Saharan Africa are running at about a 20th of the intensity of an American or a Canadian or an Aussie. No reason they can't come up to the same level as we do over 50 years. Everybody converges at about the same level of material intensity. And our way of life is, though, far better. Because you say, wait a minute, how can you have less material intensity and a better way of life? And I'd say the answer is easy. It's easy to imagine it being better. You talk to anybody who's got their eyes open and their ears listening in current Game A, and people are not satisfied at all, particularly younger people, particularly young people thinking about having a family. I've got a daughter with a 4-year-old, and I talked to a lot of her friends, a lot of people in the Game B world. Nobody who's thinking is satisfied with the way we currently live, and we all understand that we could be living in a much better way. And so the trade is cut our material intensity by 2/3 and see if we can increase our well-being by 3x by living in ways with a social operating system and with status games, which are much more congruent with human nature.
Yeah, so do you want to get into the kind of monetary system you came up with, or do you want to more get into the solutions on the cultural level you think need to be implemented, maybe more like living in more smaller communities near the Dunbar number? What direction do you think is most interesting to go on that?
I would say the monetary thing is interesting, but it is at this point not what I would say where the core of the action is. It's I have not that I haven't thought about it, but if people want to see the video where I do the biggest job of laying out this new money system, it's on YouTube. It's titled "Dividend Money: An Alternative to Central Banker Managed Fractional Reserve Banking," and it's very, very detailed, and it would bore the shit out of most people. So if you're a monetary nerd, it might be worth reading. But let's talk more about what we think about the social operating systems and the components and how they're built. You mentioned the Dunbar numbers, actually multiple Dunbar numbers, but the one most people are aware of is the Dunbar 150 number. It's 150 people, which is Dunbar. I had Robin Dunbar on my podcast, by the way. Very excellent episode.
Yeah,
And,
I think I listened to that one. Yeah.
and anyway, I would recommend people check that out too if they want to hear me and Robin go at it for about 2 hours. Um, he believes, and I think there's a lot of other research, David Graeber is generally in support of this idea, that the 150 is the level at which our forager epoch ancestors lived for about 95% at least of the history of the human race. Where people, they used to call them hunter-gatherers, the new politically correct name is foragers, and for good reason, they do other things other than hunt and gather. And they typically lived in bands of maybe 30 to 50, but those bands, a cluster of 3 or so, considered themselves almost like an extended family. They get together regularly. They transfer people between the bands, etc. And that was at about 150 people. And the thinking is, why that number? And that seems to be the level at which humans are capable, without writing or machinery, to keep track of the social calculus of who owes who, who's a good person, who's a bad person, etc. And so that's the thinking on where the Dunbar number came from. And we've concluded that we were evolved to live at the Dunbar number, and so that it makes sense for us to rethink our social operating system such that at the bottom of the stack are units roughly in the Dunbar range, somewhere between half a Dunbar or a third of a Dunbar to 3 times the Dunbar number. And sometimes we call those proto-Bs. This is the basic building block. But we also live in a modern world where we need to do lots of things that are big and interesting and require far more than 150 or even 500 people. And so Game B now thinks of itself as a series of interlocking and encapsulating membranes, where, let's think of these communities, these Dunbar number communities, can join into multiple membranes that include multiple of them. And any given lowest level membrane can be a member of multiple upper level membranes. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose there are 5 Dunbar sized communities that are involved in organic agriculture. They could form together a bubble that includes all of them with respect to agriculture only. And it could be essentially an agricultural co-op that buys agricultural supplies and helps them market their products. And so that's a membrane that includes the 5 lower level membranes, but only with respect to agriculture. And then the same 5 membranes, and plus some more, could be part of the bioregional membrane for the river that runs through the valley where these guys are at. And their job in this membrane is to manage the biosphere in and around the river. And then we see higher level membranes that correspond to approximately county level things or state level things. May or may not be a nation state level thing. I personally am not a great believer in these 100 million plus nation states. I think something on the order of 10 million is a much more reasonable sovereignty level. And then, of course, because many of our problems are global, we need to have an overarching membrane, which is the whole world and the biosphere. And everything that's Game B must live within that membrane. And each membrane has its own operating system, which is laid out in what we call accords, ACCORDS. Each membrane has its accord, which is essentially the source code for its own local operating system. And they can be quite diverse. And this is something that we came upon as the solution to an age-old problem, which is war and genocide and all this generally comes because I don't like what you're doing, right? And so we conclude that's stupid. Why should I care what you do? And so we come up with, I think, a very important idea called coherent pluralism. This is one of the core ideas of Game B, that there should be only a very small number of top level accords. Like I wrote down 9 of them last time I took a whack at it. And most of them say nothing about how you organize your economy, how you organize your social life, etc. They do say that you will operate within planetary limits. So let's call it the 1/3 of the energetic intensity of our current way of life in the United States, eventually on a trajectory downward. And you'll be focused on human well-being and a few other things. But beyond that, the usual things that people kill each other over we are agnostic on. You want to have abortion? You want to make abortion mandatory? No kids allowed in your Proto-B? Fine, do it. You want to say no abortion? Fine, do it. And so long as you write it down in your accord so everybody knows the rule in the membrane, you can do what you want. The same is true for these upper level membranes. I'll give you an example, and we come up with some thinking from object-oriented programming, actually, on how these accords could work. I mentioned prior a membrane for the organic agriculture communities. It could have the membrane that is doing the agricultural co-op for these 5 communities could be organic only. And it could say, we're only going to deal with organic agricultural products. But there's 2 different ways that that accord could be set at that upper level membrane. One is applies only to that membrane so that the members of the membrane can, sell their or use their warehouses and their marketing arm to sell their organic produce, but they can also do non-organic agriculture if they're so inclined. Another way we call inherited accords would say that the upper level organic co-op could say, all right, our accord about organic is inheritable downward, meaning that anyone who joins our accord must agree to do only organic agriculture, as an example. And it turns out that this makes for a very interesting stack as these membranes within membranes within membranes start to build up, some of which have local accords, some of which they interoperate at higher level membranes with accords that only apply within the membrane for the activity the membrane is doing. But in other cases, the sort of the equivalent of a state has some inheritable accords, which the membranes that join it choose to incorporate into their own accords. So you get this very interesting structure, and it's all voluntary. That's the beauty of it. You never can be forced to join a membrane, and when you do, you either you only do so if you accept the downwardly applicable accords. And here's another key part of that. As I said, you could have no abortion or a all abortion community. You might not like either one of those. Fortunately, because the lowest level is at the Dunbar number, where the strongest sauce is likely to occur. Easy to move. Vote with your feet. In fact, 2 of the top level accords we believe will be voice and exit. That any membrane that claims to be Game B must provide voice to all of its members. What that means, up to the local accords, but you have to have real impact into the governance machinery. And second, exit. You always have to be able to leave, and not only leave, but get a fair allocation of the balance sheet of the entity that you were in, for the time that you were in it. When you move on to someplace else. So we see a sorting of people. We see a whole series of experiments in parallel. We think this is really important. Beware of social reformers who think they know the answer, because they don't. Society is a classic complex system, and trying to get the tunings right in 100 dimensions, we're just making this shit up as we go along. And so I think of Game B as being an exploration in high-dimensional social design space. And so people will sort themselves out. Oh, they like this community, they don't like that community. And then there'll be an information bus where people can see what everybody's up to, and they can adopt the things that they want to adopt and not adopt the things they don't want to adopt. Mm-hmm. So, and it's kind of, that was kind of a heavy load, but that's kind of our conceptual thinking about Game B. And then the second part, I can stop there and you can ask more questions, but I have
no, go ahead. If you've got more to add, go ahead. I do have a question, but I can hold it.
Okay, and this is real important. This is one of the things we learned from the first breakup of Game B 1.0. The fission point was there was one group who thought individual change had to come first in terms of building a new operating system, and then another group thought new institutional structures like new monetary systems, things like that had to come first. And we literally broke up over this, had a feud, split, and said, all right, we're done. We came back. There was one thing we all agreed to, those who did choose to come back, which is the answer, of course, is both. And here's why. This is very subtle, but it's hugely important. People who have undergone journeys of personal transformation, 98% of them, there's a 2% exception approximately, but 98% of them regress fairly quickly back to where they were if they're embedded back in game A.
Hmm.
At the same time, the current status of people's capacities and how they are programmed by game A makes them not necessarily the best players in the world for the kind of game B I just described. So what we see is a spiral of individual change and institutional change, where people learn new ways of living, but they live in a place where those changes are scaffolded, where the incentive systems, the status games, just the physical way of life. It's not noisy and overstimulating. It's not poisoned by all kinds of toxic horse shit. Allows for better people. And then once the people's capacity has been upgraded, we can then design better, more functional institutions. And oh, by the way, the institutions help the people get better. So it's this spiral upward of individual change and institutional invention. And neither by itself will work. And I'd argue that most of the failures of attempts at social reform have been focusing on one or the other, not realizing that it's really about both.
Yeah. My question is, in something like that, where you have these membranes and you have like an overarching ethos, I guess, how do you like prevent, or how do you distinguish rather, like earnest game B solutions from people polluting like the idea landscape with like their ideological dogma, whether it be like woke insanity or whether it be like some right wing weirdness, and then it's just um, they present it as an alternative to game A, but it is actually a game A kind of concept that just bleeds into game B.
Well, here's several answers. Because any kind of
Yeah,
infection, you have to have multiple levels of defense, right?
yeah,
It's like the body has all kinds of different ways that it kills attempted invaders, from your skin to the acid in your stomach to your immune system. It's two different immune systems. Anyway, layered defense is always the answer, right? So first, the top level of chords will rule out certain things, right? If you're not willing to accept the top level of chords, and everybody will be held accountable to proving that they're in compliance with the top level of chords, then you can't call yourself game B. You're not part of the membrane. Now, you can fork the top level membrane if you want, because we are all about voluntarism. Someone can take the accords at the top and clone it and call it game B prime and go do their own thing, and that's on them, whatever they do. But secondly, this idea of people voting with their feet, we believe, is the principal way that bad shit doesn't grow to be too big. As I said, under the doctrine of coherent pluralism, you could have a woke proto-B or a semi-fascist proto-B. There's nothing about the accords that
yeah,
would rule either of those out. But it's our belief that over time, particularly with this horizontal information bus, where everybody knows what's going on everywhere if they want to, people will vote with their feet and say, I don't really like goddamn fucking fascists. I don't like woke assholes, right? And so why would I want to be a member of those? But if there are some that last for a while, so what? If
yeah.
a few percentage of the people
So
want to be woke
ultimately, good ideas will just win in
over
the
time.
end over
Yep.
time. Yes.
Yeah, particularly in an environment where no coercion is allowed, right? Get another top level accord item is, no coercion against people who are not in violation of the accords. So you can't make anybody join your membrane. And if you do, everybody else will kill you, right? They'll all come together in,
Yeah.
in mutual aid and mutual defense. And it's like, you're a bad person. Oh, by the way, this is very important. We get this core idea from a guy named Chris Boehm, who's a quite famous anthropologist. Unfortunately, I knew him. He actually died a couple of years ago, unfortunately. He wrote a great book called Hierarchy in the Forest. Should have been called Anti-Hierarchy in the Forest. But essentially, he did an amazing job of analyzing a very important moving part of the Forager era operating system, which is a no tolerance policy for big men, guys who want to boss other people around. And
Mm-hmm.
essentially, if anyone tried to assert themselves as a big man in a forager world, the first thing people would do is ignore them. If they started getting more forceful or violent, people would laugh at them. If they continued to escalate their big manness, they would be exiled. And if they came back, they'd be killed, right? And so we do believe that game B has to have an immune system against big men who want to be me, and I'm the boss, all that bullshit. So we believe society made its fatal error that when it moved to larger scales than the Dunbar number, very quickly we had chiefs, and then we had chiefdoms, and then we had proto-states. And for a very, very long time, those states and proto-states were run by monarchs and families and clans, etc., not by the will of the people. So an absolute core and important part is an immune system against big men. So anyone who tries coercion, if worst case, we have to come together and kill them. Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm. So, what would you say like the first like steps are to like mainstreaming Game B, like or getting it more popular off the ground in a grassroots kind of way, not like top down, but like how does that start?
We spent a lot of time thinking about this, right? First, anyone who's researched Game B finds it somewhat annoying to figure out what Game B is, because there's bits and pieces, there's videos, there's podcasts, there's white papers, there's a wiki. People can go to gameb.wiki and read a fair bit, but it's a little out of date. So myself and a co-author are pulling together the Game B book in consultation with about 30 of the other Game B thinkers that I mentioned earlier. And we think that will help being a catalytic event. But by itself, it's nowhere near enough. At the same time, we need to create the origin event, essentially. And this is kind of subtle. One of the things we came up with when we were researching the book is that you can think of Game A and Game B as forms of life. Game A is very intricate, extremely intricate, how all the flows work and all that stuff. But it works, right? And for Game B to succeed, it also has to have an intricate form of life that can outcompete Game A over time and sap its life juices and grow and eventually cause a tipping effect 40, 50 years from now, and the world becomes Game B. But to do that, just like we use the first life as the example. First there was lots of chemistry that was evolving, but none of it came together until called the abiogenesis event, where life was sufficiently rich and well designed that it could then go on from there. And interestingly, we're all descendants of that. We call it Luca, the last universal common ancestor. Every single piece of life on Earth, bacteria, yeast, a whale, a fly, and us, every one of them is a direct descendant of Luca. Luca's generations have never failed. Every turn, every cycle, Luca has successfully reproduced. Now, of course, most of the tree gets pruned away over time, but this is quite amazing. And so we believe this origin event is to figure out what the minimum viable Game B is and bring the resources together to cause the ignition. And some of the resources are people, money. I figure a few $100 million, maybe $1 billion, something like that. Knowledge base on how to do things like live at a third the intensity. Some expertise in things like buying land and playing the planning and zoning game. Creating legal entities to allow membranes to protect themselves via legal structures. So don't yet know exactly what that list is, but one of the first things that we'll do once we finish the book and before we publish it is to convene essentially a constitutional convention of Game B people to figure out what is the minimum ignition event that will cause Game B to come into existence and grow exponentially for the next 50 or 60 years. And that will include everything from how to do personal change to how to build buildings to how to raise money. It'll be quite an undertaking, but I believe that is what's necessary. And again, why have all these other social change movements failed or just make no noticeable change in the world? Because they did not have all the pieces necessary for abiogenesis to actually become an alternative life form to Game A.
And how do you see like governance working like when you're outside of your membrane or like in between membranes. Let's say like you get exiled from one group, like what's to prevent you from going to another group and doing something like within a group? You don't really need a police force or anything like that, but outside that you might need still some more I don't know, militarized or police kind of law enforcement. Like how do you envision it ties into like a modern society as well? Like how do you see that?
Right. During this growth period, not our problem. You get kicked out of game B, and you're game A's problem. And now,
No, I'm saying once the world is fully converted. I'm not talking about yeah. So
yeah, when it's fully converted, I mentioned that there'll be probably 3 layers up, the equivalent of a 10 million a million person polity. And I expect those membranes will be the ones that will be the equivalent of police, and they'll control all ground. Right, all ground will be allocated to some membrane. Now, in many cases, there'll be the proto-bees, the smaller ones that might control 1,000 acres, something like that, a little bit more than a square mile, maybe 4 square kilometers, and they'll enforce their law in those bubbles. And anything that's outside of those bubbles, the next level up of sovereignty will control, but only by voluntary agreement of the nearby, smaller level units. And so we may tolerate, campers outside of any membrane, or we might not. That'll be a decision for each of these upper level membranes to decide. In terms of coming back in and reinfecting, very critical. This life model gives us a very nice metaphor, which is the membranes around cells. They're called semi-permeable. Not everything can come in, not everything can go out. In fact, they're carefully evolved to allow toxins and side products, CO2, to come out of the cells, and nutrients, oxygen, this is for animals, to come in, and plants, it goes the other way about the gases.
mm-hmm.
And so every membrane will have as part of its accords, what's the rule for letting people through the membrane, right? And if you've been kicked out of another game B membrane, which will go into the game B blockchain, then there'll be either we'll just say no, or it could be an adjudication process that the membrane has. Says, all right, if you've been kicked out of a membrane and are not a member in good standing of any other membrane, then you have to go through the following process X before we're going to let you through the membrane, as an example.
So like how do you see something like incarceration or rehabilitation working in that model? Or because you can't just always kill someone. I mean, you could, but I mean, it would depend on the level of the offense they're doing, and hopefully, people can change too, right? So,
Yeah, and again, there's no
yeah,
reason that an upper level membrane that's the equivalent
okay,
of state, or even a lower level membrane, can't choose whatever it wants. Personally, I don't believe that prison works. Right? If we look at the history of prison, it seems to be a factory for producing psychopaths, basically.
yeah,
Uh,
especially the North American models, yeah,
and
yeah,
so I would strongly suggest that is not a useful model. But something like indentured servitude might be. Okay, you're sentenced to a year working in hoeing the corn in the cornfield. Uh,
mm-hmm.
it would be up to each polity to make its own decision. And again, hopefully learning through the horizontal information bus from what other people have tried and what seems to be working. And rehabilitation, I think many people can be rehabilitated, but some people can't. The 1% of population that's stone cold sociopaths. They're going to keep doing it until they can't anymore.
Yeah.
And at some point, you toss them out, they come back, you kill them. Easy enough.
Well, you could also like have enough incentives in the game B world that a psychopath is they're channeling their psychopathy in a positive way, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good point. And
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
Daniel Schmachtenberger made that point the other day when I had dinner with him. That we don't want sociopaths anywhere near the levers of power. But as the equivalent of a Marine, sure, you might well want a psychopath for that. But think very, very, our current system, unfortunately, Game A is the opposite. Game A attracts sociopaths to positions of power. It's horrible. It's one of the things that makes Game A such a mess. As I said, I was a senior executive at 2 different companies, and I've dealt with lots of senior executives at other companies. And my assessment, and it seems to be supported by some research, is something like 10% of C-level executives in corporate America are psychopaths versus about 1% in the general population. So if you've given levers of power 10x more concentrated to psychopaths, that's probably one of the biggest problems we have in our society.
Yeah, especially when it's combined with like the other, like the dark tetrad traits like narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sadism, right? Like that's what you really have to watch out for.
Yeah, and again,
Yeah, yeah.
they come in a continuum. Lots of people are
Oh, of
somewhat
course.
narcissistic, and some people are sadistic for entertainment purposes, and
And
so
some are like subclinical psychopaths, but they're not like full on.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
So yeah.
you always have to use discernment in this. And again, but on the other hand, if a person has a long history of committing predatory crimes with no remorse and no seeming willingness to change at all, then
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think prison is good. I mean, punishment can work as a deterrent in some cases, but I was more saying for like pragmatic reasons, like balancing the ethics of just not killing people unless you absolutely have to, but keeping them away from society, and keeping the rest of everyone else safe, because I don't think it necessarily always goes to the degree of we need to execute the person.
yeah, but I
But
say most of the time it doesn't. Just like the
yeah,
foragers, right? They
yeah,
exiled you, and maybe there's a proto B of criminals. They can all get together and prey on each other. But if they try to come out of that proto B and prey on other people, then nope, sorry, boom.
it's a
And
fair point.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So we just don't not going to allow them in our membranes. And if they continue to act badly in a predatory fashion and prey on the human race, no reason to have them around.
So how do you think we can like move away from like a money market economy to something more novel? I've heard you talk about this before, but I've never got like a full picture of how that would work, or what you mean. But I largely agree. I just want to know what that would look like to you.
Now, of course, it's not fully defined yet, and that's a work that Game B will have to evolve over time. But let's give an example of the proto B, a lowest level membrane. And let's take the case of people actually living in a village together. Uh, they could choose to do what's called single wallet voluntary communism. And this is the way the kibbutzes in Israel originally ran. And about 20% of them still run this way 100 years later, where within the membrane, there is no money, right? That, as Mark said, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Now, of course, there has to be a governance process to keep free riders and abusers and things like that from taking more than they should. But people can choose to fund internally, dining halls, laundry services, childcare, education, housing, etc., so that no money need trade hands within the bubble. Then the bubbles will have protocols in which they operate with each other, which will be some form of currency or at least accounting records. So let's say we want to buy some furniture from a proto B that designs furniture, and we do organic agriculture. We might do barter, but there's a reason that money existed, which is a level of abstraction to allow the farmers to buy the furniture, even if the furniture people don't want to buy their organic tomatoes. And so there'll need to be some form of accounting to allow those kinds of multi-step relationships. But they need to be ones that are not exploitive, not ones that have built-in need for exponentiation. The problem with our current money, particularly since 1971 when we went off the gold standard, is that we're in a situation where the monetary world has to keep growing exponentially or it will crash. Almost crashed in 2008. And at some point in the future, it probably will crash, which will be an interesting opportunity for Game B. And so our mechanism of accounting, which is all money is, needs to be designed not to require exponentiation, to be transparent, and not to be subject to exploitation by financial intermediaries. It's a scary and disgusting thing that 30% of the corporate profits in America today go to financial companies. What the fuck, right? That's crazy.
Yeah.
And so this it needs to be transparent and essentially self-organizing without the need for all these parasites. So it gives you, at least that points you towards what we need. The details still to be worked out.
Okay, so like, what real world examples of game B do you already see like happening since you've, or what obviously we can point to some countries in Europe that might meet a threshold that's at least game B adjacent. It might not be quite game B yet, but what do you see is like something going in the right direction that you would like to implement or carry over to, I don't know, North America?
Yeah, there's a couple of small projects that I would say are game B-ish, little communities on the ground, but they're not, I would say, not pure game B. So the first thing, well, and that's, I will like to see some of those come, like at least 10 or 20 come into being once we build this reactor that brings it to life. But I also see the opportunity to do much lighter things like a babysitting co-op, for instance. It doesn't cost much. All you really need is a ledger. And people who live in a community can swap babysitting services with each other, et cetera. But in terms of things that exist in the world today that we can use as examples, I still believe the best example is the Israeli kibbutz, in that these are people who have a membrane, very specific rules about how you become a member, very specific rules how you leave, what happens when you leave, et cetera. Each one has its own accords. Each of the accords is different. They vary now from voluntary communism on one end to fairly radical capitalism on the other. They have protocols for trading with each other and paying each other for services. So I would say the Israeli kibbutz system is the closest thing. And of course, we have some learnings from the generally failed experiments in things like eco villages. There's one in India. What's it called? Aurora or something? Or Oroville. That's it. There's some things to be learned there, both on the good and bad side. But none of those have what I would call ignition. They're not strong enough. They don't really work. So at best, they're holding game A at bay. They are not growing exponentially and sucking the juice out of game A. Unlike the Israeli kibbutzes, which, by the way, even though they're only 2% of the population, are 20% of the agricultural production of Israel, and 20% of the manufacturing capacity of Israel, and 50% of the agricultural production of Israel. So they actually work, unlike your typical hippie commune, which is doing some hand-knotted hammocks or some goddamn thing, and everybody's living a bad life. And certainly, and at best, they keep things barely going, but they're not expanding in the way a true game B entity needs to be.
So how do you see like certain game A systems, just for an example, like socialism or capitalism, fitting into like a game B world? Like you gave the example of some being more radical capitalist, some being more like socialist. And I've heard you say something like you're on the left of Bernie, at least on economic matters. Can you get into like what you would see as like an ideal way of like formulating certain membranes, at least?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I would say one of the influences upon me is anarchic syndicalism, which was a late 19th century, early 20th century idea, which was neither communist nor capitalist. It was generally considered part of the family of things related to socialism, but it really wasn't nothing like a state socialist. The idea there is that companies are membranes. And like any membrane, it's got an accord and it's governed by its members. And so it's fairly close to a co-op business model like we would see in the United States, or the famous Spanish example, the Mondegans, whatever it is, about 80,000 people in Basque region of Spain that have built some amazingly good companies that are 100% owned by the employees. So I see most businesses being owned by their employees, and frankly, also often being grounded in communities or in a cluster of communities. So let's say 5 near together proto-bees decide they're going to invest together and create a factory, which they all jointly own. And through that ownership, all the members of the proto-bee own, let's call it a canning plant or something like that. And that thing may be run as a business with a membrane around it, but the economic benefits come down to the members. The other big fix I now realize is going to be absolutely necessary to do this right is the idea of individual persons being controllers of investable capital. It's a really bad idea, right? The idea that Jeff Bezos has $150 billion he can invest in whatever he wants, right? For the further aggrandizement of the ego of Jeff Bezos. He's obviously way beyond the level of having to worry about hookers and cocaine, right? He can have all the hookers and cocaine he wants and not even spend the interest on his interest. But the idea of individual persons controlling the investable assets of the world seems to be a singularly bad idea. And so that investable assets ought to be administered by communities. The investable assets that are built up in a proto-bee should be administered by the proto-bee. Upper level membranes, through things that look like taxation or voluntary contributions, may have big pools of money, right? But again, the governance machinery of that proto-bee ought to include the rules for investment. Now, it may be that a proto-bee hires a person to do the investing for them in the same way foundations hire fund managers. But at the end of the day, the decision about what to invest in is owned by the collective, not by the individual. See, this is one of the things that socialism got right, but they put it in the hands of the state rather than hands of the individual at multi-scale. I do believe that getting the major investment decisions out of the hands of persons is going to be a key part for successfully building Game B.
Yeah, I think whatever system there is, it has to properly incentivize or take the best parts of our human nature and de-incentivize the worst parts. But I wonder, because sometimes I wonder what is actually human nature or what's been conditioned by game A, and it's hard for me to tell. Does something like ego really matter, or is that like something inherent? Like, did we evolve this need for? I think there is some level of that. So how do we balance like the individual versus the collective within a membrane? What if an individual within a membrane is a little bit more not pathologically so, but just within a normal spectrum of selfishness, and they want to hoard more stuff, but they're not really harming the commons in any way? Like, how do we navigate stuff like that? Or they would just live in a membrane that's more selfish or something? Or how would that?
Yeah, that'd be my answer. Is that yes, there may be membranes that choose to be that way, but the ones I would choose to live in are ones that are much more egalitarian, and that's implemented.
Yeah, me as well.
Through their accords, and I do think it's an interesting point though that you hit on. So I'm glad you asked the question. One of the things that I think we pride ourselves in Game B is realizing that Game B has to work for all kinds of people, irrespective of their personalities, their family endowments, their education, their IQ, right?
Yeah.
Things like the libertarians. I was an idiot libertarian when I was young, but I've come to realize that libertarianism will never work unless the whole world has an IQ 130 and came from a reasonably stable family. So Game B has got to have an accommodation so that every person can live, other than predatory psychopaths, can live a life of dignity and fulfillment within Game B. And again, this is one of the problems of Game A, right? It's designed for, I guess you'd call it, let's think about the ocean protocol, the ocean definition of personality: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. It's basically designed for people high on conscientiousness and high on extroversion.
Extroversion.
Yeah, it's designed for those two classes of people, and everybody else suffers. because it's driven by conscientious extrovert. Oh, by the way, I'm one of those. And guess what? I was very successful playing game A. But there's lots of people who aren't in that category. And our society needs to give absolute equality of dignity and quality of life to people, irrespective of what their personality is.
Yeah, or what they're capable of, too.
Yeah, I mean, say a person IQ of 80, in the traditional Dunbar level, even because the agricultural villages of Europe were still operating at the Dunbar number until at least 1850. And so if you were a person with an IQ of 80, guess what? You had a job hauling the water from the well to the blacksmith shop, right? And was it economically worth the blacksmith to have you do that? Probably not. But the social covenant was everybody had a role. And I see Game B the same way. We make sure everybody has a role that provides them with human dignity and productive work within their capacity.
Yeah, compassion is a big part. I always wondered, especially being disabled and being so reliant on others for survival assistance, being dependent. I wondered, like, because I don't know if being alive today and being disabled is like a byproduct of progress, like modernity, or that certain tribes actually treated disabled people really well. So there's some record of that, but obviously I'm a benefit of technology and everything that like advanced, and I'm not like some neo-Luddite. I don't like anarcho-primitivism, although there's some elements of it that are interesting. And I'm not a techno pessimist, but I'm also not a techno optimist. I like to think of myself as a realist. I wonder what you think of things like going to more AI and like Neuralink and stuff like that. I think those things could be hugely beneficial, but I also wonder if there could be downstream consequences and trade-offs that are not worth it. For an example, what if we have like a neural link that actually like takes over our brain or turns us into like pea zombies or something like that? What's your thought on like the safety and efficacy of these kind of things?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would suggest that I'm like you. I'm a technical realist, right? Certainly not a
Yeah,
Luddite. Like you, I've benefited from modern medical technology. I'd been dead by now if it hadn't been cutting edge modern medical technology. Uh,
same here.
and I'm glad to be alive. And I enjoy technology. I helped build a lot of the technology, some of the technology of the world. And further, my dream for humanity is that eventually we bring the universe to life. And to do that, we have a long way to go in terms of increasing our capacity. And it's also important that when we think about how humans interact with the biosphere, technology can be very helpful for that. A Game B guy, I don't know if he'd consider himself a Game B guy, but we consider him one, is Tyson Yunkaporta. And
Oh yeah, yeah, the indigenous guy in Australia, right?
yeah, it's great. He's been on my podcast
Yeah,
4 or 5 times.
yeah,
Wonderful fellow. Anyway, he coined an expression, which is humanity should think of itself as the custodial species for the earth, right? There are things that our technology can help us do to manage the ecosystems. For instance, just a dumb one, the drip irrigation systems in Israel reduce the amount of water used in agriculture by 90%. In much of the United States, by far the biggest use of of water isn't cities, it's agriculture. So there's an example where cutting edge technology could do the job. And there'll be many of those. On the other hand, this is again another key Game B top level accord item. Every decision that we make as humans should be made with so-called omni-consideration, not just think of the first order effect, but try to think out as far as you can to what the second and third, maybe even fourth order effects will be. Now, you can't think out infinitely. This is one of the things that we learn from complexity is that eventually our ability to predict just breaks down entirely. Uh,
yeah.
but the Mennonites, for instance, the Amish are very interesting at this. They will debate for quite a while whether to adopt a new technology or not. And and not necessarily on its economic impact, though not ignoring the economic impact, but rather what will it do to our way of life? Will our way of life be improved or made worse? An example is the milking machine, right? A fair number of Amish and Mennonites are in the dairy business, and it's a lot of work to milk cows by hand. On the other hand, it provides a lot of jobs. And so when the milking machine first came out, many of the Amish said no to the milking machine. And some of the Mennonites said yes, others said no. Over time, the equivalent of the proto-B membranes have mostly changed so that most have said that it's worth adopting. But it took them 25 years to come to that social conclusion. And I would hope that a game B technology world would use discernment about whether we should adopt technologies or not.
On whether it hinders humanity or is leading to the betterment of humanity will depend on the technology. Do you think all tech, do you think some tech is good and some is bad, or do you think some tech is neutral? Like how do you see? Do you see all tech as like a potential tool for either or do you think it depends on the technology specifically?
I think most technologies are relatively neutral. But if you go to the next step and say, how are the technologies organized into business models? That's where the problem arises.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, this is a Rutt-only theory, not necessarily an official game B theory. But I believe the internet was a great thing for humanity until advertising arrived. Around 2001, 2002, the price of computation and network capacity got cheap enough that major websites who had their act together could figure out how to fully fund their business by advertising. They then became attention hijacking machines of ever greater potency. At first, the advertising was laughably bad and ineffective, but was just effective enough to be able to support a website, a primitive website. But now, of course, we have machines like Facebook, and the top of the food chain is a horrendous thing called TikTok, which uses unbelievably good and powerful AI to mine our behavior, to put shit in our face, right? And basically completely ruined the internet. I think we'd be better off today having no internet than the internet we have. On the other hand, I believe we could have a wonderful internet if we got rid of advertising as the basis for the business model. So there's an example where the technology itself is neutral, but the business models that Game A forces people into are often very bad.
Basically removing perverse incentives as much as you can.
Absolutely. And in fact, and of course, not anyone's necessarily guilty here. One of the ideas in Game B is the multipolar trap. If one person does it and you don't respond, you're at a big disadvantage, right? So how do we all agree not to have advertising on our site? That's a governance question and an important one. Because if one guy does, he has more revenue coming in and he'll maybe be able to outcompete you, raise more capital less expensively, get a bigger audience because he doesn't have to charge. But if we all agree, hold hands and say, we are not going to let inside our membranes any advertising supported electronic services, then they'll eventually wither away and better services will come into being that are designed for our empowerment and to make our life better, not to hijack our attention to sell us cheap Chinese shit.
And on to a little bit of a different topic that I've heard you talk about before a little bit. What do you think, how do you think we can deal with, wokeness? Because I'm still concerned about woke, and a lot of people go on about it a little bit too much, but I think, especially being disabled, I'm worried about the wokeification of, disability issues, because then nobody will take disability serious, because it'll just be seen as some identity thing or some kind of exaggerated grievance or us versus them. I don't like this hyperfixation on race and gender, although they can be important aspects. but the fundamental things that matter, like class and health and ability, things that actually are tangible and affect people, um, how do you think we can change the conversation to be more about those uh, dynamics instead of fixating on like gender and race, but also not ignoring those issues and the pendulum going too far the other way and discounting legitimate cases of racism or sexism? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
It sounds like I'm exactly where you are. There are still residuums of racism, even in the United States and in other countries, a lot more. You never find a more racist place on earth than Japan, right? For instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the United States, there were still some, and of course, the legacy of how we grossly mistreated our black citizens is still with us in all kinds of subtle and not so subtle ways. Uh, Gender or sex, all this fucking bullshit about sex and gender, I can't keep it all straight anymore. But women have been oppressed for at least 10,000 years. And in fact, I've said more than once, when the 20th century is looked back at 1,000 years in the future, it won't be the atomic bomb. It won't be landing on the moon. It won't be the internet. It'll be the beginning of the emancipation of women in the West. They'll be considered the biggest achievement of the 20th century. And there's still a long way to go. On the other hand, woke is not the answer. It's a reactionary retreat to a kind of inverse model of racism and sexism.
Mm-hmm.
Racism is literally one of the definitions of racism, the discrimination based on race. Lowering the standards to have people get into college based on race is racism, right? Pure, simple dictionary definition. So I reject wokeism as neo-tribal racism and sexism, essentially. But at the same time, to your point, we can't ignore the realities of the fact that different people have different effects and different trajectories. So we should look at people as individuals, not as collectives. It's that's the key. And again, personally, I would see much more interest in looking at things like class or the endowments that a person had in whatever form they were, right? If you have crazy ass parents, that's a disendowment, right? If you're disabled, that's a disendowment, though it's an opportunity in some ways.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah, like people that are blind have much better audio acuity, for instance.
Yeah.
But of course, overall, we would choose not to be blind and just have somewhat worse hearing, most people. So I think I'm with you that there is the thing that turned into woke. Unfortunately, there are some real problems that need to be worked, but woke is not the fucking way to do it. It's like the worst way to do it. And people are rebelling against it. I would say peak woke hit around 2021, and I'm seeing it recede at a fairly rapid rate. And I do a fair bit of work with universities. And here's my take about universities, which are the hotbed of woke. It's probably only 15% of the professors are woke, but
What about the student body?
Was that?
What I said? What about the student body? What would you say the percentages of woke?
It's hard to say, but let me use the professorate first. I know a little bit more about them.
Okay.
And then we can apply the same model to the student body. Maybe 15% are actually woke, but another 50% are in fear of the wokes. And so they're conforming with wokery. And once wokery gets down below some level, a big chunk of that 50 is going to switch back to traditional classic liberalism, universal humanism, as I like to call it. In the student body, the survey research I've seen is that it's a bit higher. It might be 20, 25% actual woke and another 40% woke fellow travelers in fear of being called unwoke. But it's probably no more than 25% actually woke. And so once it becomes unfashionable, uncool to be woke, there'll be a quick phase change where the people feel like they're released from the fear of being attacked by wokes, and they'll say, fuck all that shit. At least that's my prediction.
Yeah, you came up with this, what is it, merit, equality, and fairness as like a counter to DEI?
That wasn't me. That was Dorian Abbott, University. University of Chicago. I had him on my podcast. We talked about merit, fairness, and equality as a replacement for DEI. What the fuck does DEI stand for? Something or other.
Diversity, equity, inclusion. Yeah.
And that's interesting. When I do some still advising CEOs, one of the first things I suggest they do is get rid of the E in DEI. It's equity that's the poison. You know,
Yeah,
if properly understood, diversity and inclusion are good things, but equity, as defined by the wokies, is absolute poison, and we should not do business with any companies that have E in their DEI.
yeah, for sure. Um, like the like I've even noticed DEI like in infecting, at least in Canada where I am in Ontario, like government programs. Like if you apply for like attendant care funding or something like that, there'll be this line where they'll say something like, "Oh, blacks first," or something to that effect, or we black disabled lives matter instead of just disabled. Like they're doing all this weird disingenuous virtue signaling. It's like if you're LGBTQ, like apply, like it's just really bizarre. Like how do we get that kind of I think they did this with like farmers during COVID in the US as well. Just a bunch of weird like the only way out of that I think is to push forward the with the MFA, I guess you would call it, the merit, fairness, equality. Do you think since that wokeness is like past peak woke, I guess is my question. Do you think that kind of we're returning to that kind of more colorblind, um, I guess, in assessing someone as an individual, or do you still think most, well, I shouldn't say most people, but the mainstream narrative is still overwhelmingly woke? Where would you say we're at right now, like culturally speaking?
I'm not 100% sure where we are, but I would say we're still in the range, in the realm where woke is very influential because of the fear factor. But in absolute numbers, it continues to be a relatively small minority. And when the fear breaks on the people intimidated by woke, that's when the big change will happen. I think it's happening faster in the U.S. than it's happening a lot of other places. Canada, for some reason, gone fucking nuts in the last few years. I mean,
Well,
uh,
it's like California on steroids.
yeah, it's
It's
like
terrible.
I've spent a lot of time in Canada. Thompson is a Canadian company, second biggest Canadian
Hmm.
company in Canada. I worked for them for years. I had a cottage on a lake in Ontario. My wife and I did. Her family did for 40 years. So spent a lot of time up there. I was chairman of the board of a company in Ottawa. I was director of a company in Saskatoon. I spent a lot of time in Canada. I know lots of Canadians. I love Canadians, but this current government is just a piece of shit. Guys got to get rid of those fuckers.
Yeah. Um, going back to like perverse incentives in terms of like governments and like corporations, how do we set up like systems that prevent them from colluding or doing things that are deleterious to like the population? For an example, like I don't know, big pharma and big food basically profiting off each other by making people sicker and unhealthier by uh, putting I don't know like ultra like processed food, so people get high blood pressure and then they come up with more high blood pressure meds or Ozempic and all these kind of feedback loops which actually are not conducive to well-being but are actually just a matter of like how do you think a game B world can fix those kind of things? That was just an example I came up with.
Yeah, it's a good
Um,
example. And I would say
yeah,
that in the game B world, we would hope, again, we haven't done it, so we can just talk about it, is that if people have evolved as people, right, that they have had personal change and embedded in the scaffolding institutions that support those changes, they will be immune to that stuff. They will know you shouldn't be eating fucking Fritos and washing it down with half a gallon of Coke, Coca-Cola, that is, because you'll have been raised in a context where it's become clear that you should eat good food, that's really an important part, and it's part of our common culture within our membranes. And so I think it's personal change scaffolded by institutions. So I imagine a Proto B that has a common dining hall, the food will all be natural, clean, good, nutritious, etc. In terms of coercion, I think we could have coercion within the Game B bubble. We may choose to vote no processed food can be manufactured by any Game B business. I don't know. Maybe we will. Maybe we won't. But if Game A wants to continue to eat Fritos and drink Coke, good luck, guys. Over time, we'll outcompete them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not our job. It's our job to be role models to Game A and to people, more importantly, people in Game A. But again, we're not going to try to coerce Game A anytime soon.
So, how do you think people can, I guess, put their money or their time or their abilities, whatever, in a way that helps Game B? Like, what would you recommend businesses or individuals to do within the Game A system, like as things stand now? Yeah.
Okay. Again, we will be calling a play in about 18 months that will have very specific things people can do. But in the meantime, first, if you're thinking about a business, consider doing it as a co-op, founding a business owned by the employees. Now, there's a new form of co-op called a hybrid co-op that makes it easier to raise funds for it. I did a podcast on it with a really good attorney who specializes in setting up hybrid co-ops. The other thing to do is to focus locally at mutual aid. Things like the babysitting club example that I gave, a dinner club where people get together once a month and have a potluck dinner, musical get-togethers, conviviality and face-to-face is really important. And also, when you're doing a lot of work virtually, as I do, make sure you invest in face-to-face as well. I'm a great believer that virtual is cheap and fast and wide-ranging, but it's relatively weak. Face-to-face is strong links, and an even stronger form is intimacy, where you're actually, interconnected with somebody in some serious way, like your very best friends, not just your romantic partners. And making sure you're building a world of weak links, strong links, and intimate links, I think, is a very important precursor. In terms of the personal things you can do, is to the degree that you can disconnect from the status game. Don't think one of the ways people say, well, how do we know we're in Game B? I say, well, somebody drives up in a Porsche, everybody will laugh at them. That's one of the ways we'll know we're in Game B. So, don't be that guy, right? Don't play the status game if you can at all avoid it. Go out of your way to avoid exposure to electronic advertising. It's worth paying the $2 a month more to Hulu or whatever the hell it is, not to get the ads. So get yourself away from ads. Don't play to the degree you can. Don't play the status game. Until we have new status games to play, it's going to be difficult. But realize.
What do you think healthy status games look like that incentivize like good behavior?
I'll give you a very simple example. Traditional status games in the history of the human race has been successful parents of a family of good kids, right? That was a high status thing to do, and still is in other parts of the world outside of late stage Game A. And so that would be an example. People who create a family, raise their kids properly, and they can be proud of the kids that they have, and do so in a way that's embedded in the community, I think is a classic status game. Another example, have you ever been in the Boy Scouts? You know about the Boy Scouts? I was a Boy Scout. And there's like 120 merit badges you can get, archery, basket weaving, hunting, on and on and on. And one could imagine there being a whole bunch of proven skills that people have. And the Boy Scouts had a quite extensive mechanism for assessing whether you really had what it took to get the merit badge. And you might can imagine, instead of being this two dimensions in Game A, which is money and sexual attractiveness, right? Instead, the status games could be 150 different dimensions, right? I'm a great hunter and wood carver, and you're a great basket weaver and cook. Nobody can say that one of those is better than the other. They're just different dimensions of status. So a multi-dimensional status focused on your role in the community, including parenting, but other ways of helping the community. So you're a person who chooses not to have children, but you are a person that's heavily involved in the operating system of the community on the ground. It's another way to gain great status. And so those are at least pointing at, and then of course the traditional status games like great music. I would hope that our music in Game B is not about a few global celebrities, but rather the great musician players within a bicycle ride, right? So I can ride over to their concerts and they can come right over and play for us. And the person that's a really bumping banjo player will have a certain kind of status for that skill, and they should. So that's at least pointing in the direction that I think the status games need to go. Because we're not going to get rid of status games. Humans are and chimps are status seeking animals, but we need to repoint the status vector towards healthy things.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if not to be disjointed or go back a step, but it just occurred to me as I was thinking here. Do you think there's any way to take the I guess the benefits or the good ideas within I wouldn't say woke thought, but basically for an example, I like the idea of intersectionality. I just don't like the dogma around it. So I think intersectionality exists, but it's not universally fixed. So in some cultural arenas, you might be more privileged if you're black, or more privileged if you're white, or you, or. But I don't think things like race and gender always are the central point. It could be just things like lookism or heightism, or how you come up, like how can we talk about intersectionality in a way that is like non-dogmatic and empirically grounded based on data, like not just personal experience. It can be informed by standpoint theory and what we like, how we feel about things, but like in based on like earnest like introspection, and not just whatever the social narrative is about being a member of a certain group, but actually what it's do you see where I'm going with that kind of?
Yeah, exactly. Seems like we have a lot of similar views. When I first heard of intersectionality, I thought it was like a really interesting and good thing, right? Because it is true that being a black woman is a different thing than being a black man or a white woman. The intersection of black, that was what originally it meant. The intersection of two dimensions.
Or mixed race even.
Yeah. But here's when I didn't even hear about it until it was pretty far along, and I looked into it. I go, what the fuck? This is just the identity game with these small numbers of divisions. In reality, intersectionality, thought of correctly, is to acknowledge the hundreds of dimensions that humans have, and realize that every one of us is a vector with different settings on all 150 of those things. If we pick a number out of the air,
and there might be advantages or disadvantages depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. I was very surprised to find intersectionality only focused on the negatives rather than the full valences that are available on all 150 dimensions. And again, that gets back to thinking of ourselves as individuals, right? Okay, what is the summation of all the forces that act upon us from our endowments in the world? And that's a real thing. But the bullshit game of intersectionality, as it ended up being deployed in the world, is just yet another example of of crapola and neo-tribal and racism and sexism. But there's certainly, but to your point, absolutely, the core idea of intersectionality is correct. It was just implemented in a very bad fashion.
Yeah, but like the person that formulated it, I think was Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was doing it with the intention of pushing woke ideology, but I think she accidentally stumbled onto like a really good idea. If you take away the baggage of it and all the unsavory aspects of wokeness, and you just look at it as an idea itself, I think it's really good, and people can investigate or I think social scientists should investigate the actual effects of having certain traits or attributes and how it affects people in society, so we can more accurately understand and empathize with people rather than just basing it on whatever academic or Hollywood ideological kind of dogma is like fashionable at a specific time.
Yeah, I agree, 100%. And then a more mature thinking about it as a very complex fitness landscape, right? Every person fits in a specific spot based on their settings of all these attributes, and thinking about that in a nuanced fashion. That each of us has our benefits and our disadvantages, and in the aggregate, some of us are probably worse off, and some of us are better off by our endowments, and that's the useful thought from intersectionality, but we need to consider far more dimensions and really think about the intersection of a whole bunch of these dimensions in terms of what they mean. So yeah, I think we probably agree pretty much on that.
And how to also empower people instead of perpetuating like victimhood and this kind of like how would you say, what psychological process do you think or social process can be implemented to be more focused on the positive, like you said?
I don't really know. I'm not a psychologist. I'll leave that one to the social
Cool.
change people.
Sorry to bother you, but I'm walking.
Okay.
Do you want to wrap up, or is there anything else you want to cover? I have a few more questions, but you kind of answered most of them in previous questions that I asked. So
yeah, I feel like I got been able to project a good sense of where we're at with Game B thinking at this point. So I'd be happy to wrap it here.
Yeah, that'd be cool. It was very nice talking to you, and I really appreciate your time. I mean, I've been listening to you on and off for years, and this means a lot to me, and being able to contribute to this. Sorry that I was a bit disjointed. I was a bit tired. I didn't sleep well last night, but I really enjoyed our talk.
Yeah, you're obviously very well prepared, and you ask great questions. So I'm always happy to interact with people who do as good a job as you're doing.
Yeah, well, I'm doing my best, and I look forward to talking again sometime.